Dear Sikion Penpasering, dear Speaker of Tibetan Parliament, my friend Jigme Sering, distinguished parliamentarians and esteemed guests, a todos los latinoamericanos presentes, con especial cariño. It's an honor and a privilege to address you from Guadalajara, Mexico today. I want to express my sincerest gratitude for your presence and your commitment on this 9th World Parliamentarian Conference of Tibet. Your dedication to the Tibetan cause is a beacon of hope for millions. We gather today with a clear and urgent purpose to secure the future of Tibet and protect its valuable culture. The Tibetan people face immense challenges, from the repression of their human rights to the attempt to erase their unique cultural identity. We cannot ignore the plight of our brothers and sisters in Tibet. Their resilience is admirable, but they desperately need our voice and our support. Tibet is not just a territory. It's a legacy of peace, compassion, and wisdom that enriches all the humanity, all our world. Let's call for action and diplomacy to ensure the self-determination of the Tibetan people is respected. You, as leaders, as legislators, have the power to make a profound difference. I urge you to carry the voice of Tibet to your parliaments, to your governments, to your communities. Let's work together to ensure that Tibetan culture and heritage do not vanish. Let's remember the words of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who inspired us to seek peaceful solutions and defend the truth. Your commitment today is the most important step toward a free Tibet and a more just humanity. Thank you very much for your attention, for your courage, and for your unwavering support. Tibet is counting on us. Thank you, and I hope to see you soon in Mexico.
Dear guests, friends from around the world, greeting to all. I am Chu, a senior member of Taiwan's parliament. Today, Tibet is facing a human catastrophe, an ongoing cultural crisis, demographic crisis, and a religious crisis that is unfolding before our every eyes. Tibet once possessed a proud culture and religious heritage, but today, under China control, there is no trace of human right or freedom at all. Even more absurdly, they have no freedom of religious belief and are prohibited from learning their own mother tongue. Monasteries are being forcibly demolished, and possessing an image of the Dalai Lama can result in imprisonment. This is a disaster that extends far beyond a single nation's concern. It's a matter of civilizational survival for the entire world. I hereby make a firm appeal to China. Please stop the oppression of the Tibetan people. Respect religious freedom and preserve their cultures. Above all, do not eliminate the Tibetan language. Taiwan has experienced the painful consequence of mother tongue suppression. Even nowadays, many people cannot speak their native language at all. This was not done for political control. It is the pain that dictators bring to the world. The world must not allow the Tibet to follow the same path. I also call upon the world to impose strict prohibition on the Chinese government's persecution of Tibetan. I believe that as U.S.-China trade tension intensify, China will face increasing pressures on the Tibet issue. Our dedication to this issue must remain unwavering. In the face of a long-term struggle against the Chinese Communist Party, we must maintain our conviction and faith. Taiwan has walked the path from authoritarianism to democracy. Through continuous resistance, we end martial law, achieve full parliamentary election, and secure the direct election of our president. We deeply understand the freedom must be continuously fought for. Precisely because of the experience, we cannot remain silent. We must continue to speak out with courage. Let us all stand together with Tibet and defend our human rights. Thank you all.
We, the non-partisan parliamentary group Tibet, strongly condemn the increasing repression in Tibet through the forced boarding schools for hundreds of thousands of Tibetan students. The consequence of this repression is the loss of cultural identity, uprooting and alienation from the family. Tibetan as a language is coming under increasing pressure. Accordingly, we also criticize the decision to close the Department of Tibetan and Mongolian Language Studies at the University of Bern in Switzerland. We have our questions as to whether this is a mere coincidence, a pure cost-cutting measure, and we call on all those responsible not to give in to any direct or indirect pressure from outside. Fundamental and human rights apply to all people, including Tibet.
日本国会支持西藏小组主席，各国议会支持西藏小组议员，藏人行政中央司政编拔人才，西藏议会议长堪布索南丹佩，副议长卓玛慈仁女士，藏人行政中央外交与新闻部部长诺增卓玛女士，藏人行政中央驻各国代表，大家好，我是台湾的立委范云。感谢邀请我来为第9届世界国际议会支持西藏大会献上我的祝福。自1959年中共统治西藏以来，有6000座寺庙被破坏，不计其数的藏人遭受迫害、死亡。160位藏人为西藏脱离中共统治而自焚牺牲。许多藏人也在中共高压统治下被迫流亡海外。身为台湾的立委，我多次参与声援西藏的记者会和游行，因为我认为吐蕃被中共迫害的历史是台湾人都应该补的历史课，因为我们同样面对中国共产党的威胁跟侵略。最近有越来越多人注意到，中共透过跨国的长臂管辖 （long-arm jurisdiction） 将司法干涉延伸到他国，不仅严重违反国际人权法与国家主权，更是一种毫无节制的威权扩张，对自由世界造成了重大的威胁。只要你被中国认定违反他们的国安相关法令，就有可能被第三国引渡到中国追究刑责，最重判处死刑。这些事情都警醒我们，没有人是局外人。今年尊者达赖喇嘛将迎来90岁华诞，我在此献上万分的祝福，并感谢他对西藏自由的奋斗与坚持。我也会继续用行动守护台湾的自由民主，支持西藏的自由。台湾人会跟西藏人以及全世界支持西藏的朋友们站在一起，对抗集权。最后，祝福本届大会圆满成功，我们一起继续努力。
Attention, please. The tea break is over. Please take your seats in the meeting hall. Session will be chaired by Honourable Simon O'Connor, former Member of Parliament, New Zealand, and former co-chair of IPAC. We have panelists Honourable Arif Virani, former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, Honourable Sujeet Kumar, Member of Parliament, India, and former convener of All-Party Indian Parliamentary Forum for Tibet, Honourable Pavel, Žáček, Chairman of the Security Committee and member of the Chamber of Deputies of Czech Republic. The floor is yours, sir.
Well, Tashidali, konnichiwa, bienvenue, and welcome.
Good afternoon, good morning, everyone.
Hopefully there's translation for New Zealand English, but greetings from New Zealand. Simon O'Connor is my name, former Member of Parliament and former Chair of our Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee. And just want to say quickly, it's an honour and a privilege to be here from so far away. I just want to echo too the acknowledgement of this being June 4th. And while we remember Tiananmen, we remember many, many other massacres that continue both in China and across the world. And one thing I've always been struck by is the first victims of any authoritarian regime are the people of that country themselves. So we remember, of course, China, Taiwan, the Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, and many others today. I have an amazing panel, and so one of the gifts, if you will, I'm going to bring is I'm not going to talk for too long, because I think it's actually very important, colleagues, that you have time to hear from our three panelists and obviously to answer questions before lunch. But what we are discussing fundamentally is a US piece of legislation that promoting a resolution to the Tibet-China Dispute Act of 2024, put forward by, I believe, three senators, or rather three representatives in the United States across party and signed by President Biden, but known as the Resolve Tibet Act. And long and short, delegates, it effectively says what and where Tibet is. It guarantees its borders, its language, and I think really importantly encourages the US Department of State to promote Tibetan values and again to promote the integrity of Tibet. With that, I am delighted to introduce our first speaker, the Honourable Arif Virani, as noted a former Minister of Justice and a Canadian, so we're keeping a bit of a Commonwealth theme going here at the moment. Arif, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to start by saying bonjour tout le monde, konnichiwa, tashile, and buenos dias. It's a pleasure to be here, and also just acknowledge our Japanese hosts who have been so generous and put on such an amazing event today. It is really quite something being in this building, but also being here in Japan. I want to say thank you to Simon, who I've gotten to know over the last couple of days, Pavel to my left, and also Sujeet from India. It's amazing to be on a panel of such caliber. And very specifically, I would just say quite candidly, thank you to India for plus 60 years of safety and security for His Holiness and for the people of Tibet, who are throughout the country of India and who have been given haven in India. It is quite an accomplishment unto itself. I'm speaking to you here as a former member of Parliament. So not only do we share Commonwealth ties, but we're both having exited our formal elected offices, myself and Simon. And we're joking around a little bit about that. But I think what's really important about that is to underscore that advocacy on a cause such as this doesn't stop when your elected office stops. It certainly hasn't stopped for me, and it hasn't stopped for Simon. And I think that's important because this type of advocacy is far too important to remain in the realm of only elected chambers around the planet. During my time in Parliament, there was 10 years I served in the Canadian House of Commons, and I had many parliamentary secretary roles. I also served, as Simon mentioned, as the Minister of Justice and Attorney General. But one of my proudest roles was actually as the chair of the Parliamentary Friends of Tibet Canada. And I served in that role for 7 years until I became minister, where it was a bit difficult to juggle all of those other roles, so I had to relinquish it. But I learned a lot about the Tibetan cause from my constituents, from stakeholders in Canada, and from the people in this room. And I'm deeply indebted to them. There's a couple of colleagues who aren't here because it's much harder to get away from the House of Commons when you're still a sitting member than when you're an exiting member. So James Maloney and Kareem Bardisi would have preferred to have been here, but they are advocating for Tibet as we speak in Canada's chamber. And I also want to acknowledge the 36th anniversary of Tiananmen. I'm going to presage a bit about what I say in terms of talking about that US piece of legislation, but I'm also going to proudly talk about what we've done in Canada to advance the cause of Tibet and Tibetan advocacy, and the most salient of which was a unanimous motion that was passed in the Canadian House of Commons just about a year ago, on June 10th of last year. And that unanimous motion talked about sort of 4 specific things. It talked about the cultural assimilation policy that is being waged against Tibetans by the PRC. It talked about Tibetans' right as a nation to claim the right to self-determination. It talked about free choice of social, cultural, religious, and economic decisions. And it talked, very importantly, about the notion of succession and the choice of the eventual successor of His Holiness being a matter of choice for Tibetans and Tibetans only, and not something that it should be interfered with by the PRC. What I would underscore is that it was unanimous. We have 4, sometimes 5 parties in the Canadian House of Commons. We don't agree on a lot. Some of your parliaments have, upwards of 10 parties, I can appreciate. It is hard to find unanimity. But on this one, we did find unanimity. I would say to you that at the time that this was passed, I was obviously serving as a member of the Liberal government. Our government agreed to this motion. The motion was actually introduced by a member of the third party. So I was thinking about what Else was talking about earlier about the activism and advocacy that she has shown in Belgium. And sometimes you find it's isolating, and sometimes you can find support other places. But in this case, we found support right within the Canadian House of Commons. And I think that's really, really important. Because I would say that these issues are far too important to be partisan, because it shouldn't be sort of a liberal conservative divide. It shouldn't be sort of a Christian Democrat issue versus a Liberal Party issue or a Social Democrat issue in Europe as to whether people go to bat for basic things such as freedom, religious freedom from religious persecution, the ability to maintain your own language, your own culture, and your autonomy. I think that is something that is fundamental. And you think you heard that. You heard that extensively from some of the speeches that were taped yesterday. And what really resonated for me is that there was a few things that rang true in terms of thematic points. You heard Nancy Pelosi, His Holiness, and at least one other person talking about basic defense of truth. And when you're facing with such disinformation, that's what we need to advocate for, is just the defense of truth. I'm trying to keep an eye on the time here because I know there's going to be cards that show up. Still not loud enough? I apologize. Okay, louder. But what's really important, and I tried to think of a way to analogize this as to a contemporary event for those of us in the room that aren't religious or aren't Buddhist. When Stephen Schneck, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, yesterday on the video talked about Tibetan Buddhists should decide Tibetan Buddhist leadership, I would put to you something that's very top of mind. Less than 30 days ago, a fairly important world religious leader was selected in a conclave by cardinals. I would put it to you, and I'm speaking to my America's individuals, los diputados de Costa Rica, Chile, Mexico, par ejemplo. If you are Catholic and the Italian government decided that they were going to unilaterally determine your leader, I imagine there might be some consternation, right? And that might be consternation faced by Catholics around the planet, maybe Filipino Catholics, maybe Brazilian Catholics, etc. That is exactly what we are facing right now. The notion that one government in one part of the world can determine perhaps the most known and notorious Buddhist leader on the planet. That should strike you in your gut as wrong, because it is wrong. And that's what we're talking about. Basic precepts such as that. American action. So I've told you a bit about what we've been doing in Canada, and I'll come back to it in a little bit. But the legislation, the Resolve Tibet Act, bipartisan, tremendous. There are leaders that were on that video yesterday and leaders who weren't. A guy named Jim McGovern was not. He was one of the key sponsors. He is a tremendous advocate for Tibet. It passed on a bipartisan basis in both the House and the Senate. It was an amendment to earlier legislation, so they've been legislating about this since around 2002. It's quite remarkable. If you want the text of it, it's in that book. I know you've all read it. It's page 161. It came as part of your little package. But there are critical elements. It talked about the fact that there's been a freeze in the dialogue. There was a dialogue that was happening between 2002 and 2010, and then it just stopped. It talked about the need to kickstart that dialogue. It talked about, importantly, yes, I'm going to put on the justice hat now, it talked about violations of international law. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 1, the right to self-determination. It talked about the UNGA resolutions, Resolution 1723 from 1961, which calls for the cessation of practices which deprive Tibetan people of their fundamental human rights and freedoms, including the right to self-determination. As Simon mentioned, it outlined the contours of Tibet. We've heard a lot about the language. Is it called Tibet? Is it called something else? That's important. But so is what is the territory. That is important because there's an active effort to delimit that territory to a smaller amount, which is something that Tibetans themselves have due cause and just course for contesting. It talked about countering disinformation. We've heard about that. It talked about this notion about Tibet being a part of China since ancient times, which to His Holiness's credit, he has never agreed to and will not agree to. And very importantly, and I say this conscious of the fact that we've got a Canadian diplomat here, donc Martin est ici, he's from the Embassy of Canada. It talked about the State Department and what the State Department is meant to do. And the State Department, this echoes what Elsa was talking about just in the last panel. It says that the State Department is meant to coordinate with other governments in multilateral efforts toward the goal of a negotiated agreement on Tibet. What I would say is that we should take up the State Department on that call. All of the nations in this room should take up the State Department on that call. And it talked about competing directions. This is a point that I want to make. I think it's a bit of an elephant in the room, but I think we need to address it because Catherine sort of raised it as well, the delegate from Hungary. You've got American leadership on the point of foreign policy, being forceful with accountability on the part of China on human rights abuses. But at the same time, the elephant in the room is that American economic policy, particularly right now in terms of where we are with tariffs, is actually driving nation states, including the nations in this room, towards looking towards other economic allies and stable trading partners, which actually presents an opportunity for China at the same time that the Americans may want to detract from Chinese engagement. That is a delicate conundrum that we all have to navigate, and it's something that should not be lost upon us. What I would say to you is that do we want you to do in your own parliaments? And Else and others have talked about this in the last panel, and even the panel before this. What I would say to you is that you've heard this all before. The PRC loves inattentiveness. They love it when we're distracted. They are preying on the fact that there's economic turmoil right now and that they are looking being looked at as a rife opportunity for economic alliances when other economic alliances are fraying. He's going to give me 1 or 2 more minutes because he didn't use his 10. So what I would say is be wise, be clear-eyed when we're dealing with China. I would agree with Else in terms of the fact that you are here is a courageous first step, but it can only be a first step. That is very, very important. The next step is what we do when we get back home. I would agree with Chris about IPAC. It is a tremendous forum. It allows us to aggregate. But I would say that what we need to do is show the world that we are collectively focused on Tibet and the Tibetan struggle. And that's a communications effort. And I'm going to say to you that in that book, again, around page 161, there's a whole bunch of different things that different nations have done. But there's only 11 nations listed in there. There's about 20 nations or jurisdictions represented in this room or virtually. So we've got a deficit to make up. And what I would say to you is a very personal pitch. And the personal pitch is this. A lot of us have talked about what has inspired us. I've had the very good fortune of being twice in Dharamsala. I'm going to do 60 seconds. Twice in Dharamsala. And the second time was this February. And this time I took my kids. My kids are 10 and 14. And it was very, very emotional for my kids and very, very touching for my kids. Because my kids learned about Geden Choki Nima being abducted when he was 6 years old. My 14-year-old learned about people 2 years older than him taking their own lives through self-immolation to promote the Tibetan cause and the Tibetan struggle. I want you to think about my kids, but for the parents in the room, I want you to think about your kids. And then I want you to think about those kids, 1 million of whom are in colonial boarding schools being deprived of their families, of their ability to practice their religion and speak their own language. If there's any moral imperative you need, it is there. That we need to shine a light on what is happening, we need to heed the words of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and we need to take action back in our own parliaments in whatever way you see fit, whether it's legislation, whether it's a motion, whether it's a committee study. The area is rife for exposure and transparency, and that is what it is incumbent upon all of us to do. Merci beaucoup, Tujiche. Thank you.
Thank you, Arif. We now turn from former parliamentarians and away from Canada and New Zealand to an actual member of parliament, and this time in India, to the Honourable Sujeet Kumar. A hand over to you.
Thank you, Simon. Carrying forward the Commonwealth brotherly love. Tasidalek, konnichiwa, good morning, and as we say in India, namaste. Arif has already spoken a lot about the key elements of the Resolve Tibet Act. Sorry, I am recovering from a viral flu, so I might keep coughing. Please bear with me. So to me, the two essential elements of the Act are this. It's not just a legislative piece of legislation, legislative gesture, but it's a bold political and moral statement. Yesterday, I referred to the fact that after World War II, when the world said never again, we continued seeing the kind of atrocities, the kind of worst kind of human rights abuses in various parts of the world, including Tibet, and probably as horrendous and as atrocious as what the Nazis did to the Jews in Europe. But for a long time, I think the world was more or less silent, and to me, it's striking that this Act brings to the forefront these instances of abuses to the global attention, and it's bipartisan. In a society or in a political arena as fractious as the US, the fact that this legislation was passed unanimously speaks volumes about the intent of the US. And also it sets the narrative straight on Tibet. You know, for a long time, the CCP was able to sell its false narrative that Tibet has been an integral part of China since ancient times, which we know is false, just as they were able to sell the false narrative of the peaceful rise. We now know what kind of peaceful rise China has had. So the narrative has been set straight through the elements of the Act, which I'll briefly talk about. Next slide, please. Yeah. So the act signals the intent and establishes that Tibet is not an integral part of China. Tibet is not an internal issue of China, because China has been able to convince the world that what happens in Tibet is internal to China, and that there is no scope for any external actor or any external stakeholder or any third party to meddle in this issue. And that this has been a part of China since ancient times, as I mentioned, and that the Tibetan activists are basically secessionists. This is the false narrative which China said. In fact, at one point China had said His Holiness is a wolf in sheep's clothing, the kind of language China used for His Holiness. So this act signals that it's not an internal issue of China, rather it's a global issue, and the world has to take note of it. And secondly, that the China would like to make the world believe that the dispute between China and Tibet has been resolved for all times to come, and that China has ensured that Tibet is liberated. China has ensured that the Tibetans have a modern and great way of life. The development in Tibet is unparalleled. So there is no issue of there is no pending issue in Tibet. It's all resolved. This is not the case, and we all know what's going on in Tibet. The world needs to know. The world is kind of aware of it. So this issue is unresolved, and hence there is a strong message that the Tibet issue has to be resolved. It's not resolved. It has to be resolved through negotiations, through dialogue, without any preconditions. The last round of negotiations was in 2010. From 2002 until 2010, there were about 9 rounds of negotiation. But China kept on insisting that His Holiness accepts that Tibet has been an integral part of China since ancient times, which is untrue, and hence His Holiness will never speak something which is untrue. So this precondition has stalled the further discussions and negotiations, and the act calls upon China to go for fresh negotiations without any preconditions between His Holiness or his representative or any elected member of the Tibetan Parliament. And also the act clarifies that America will back the Tibetan people until the negotiations are settled. This is essential because the Tibetan people need that kind of long-term support for their dignity, for their self-determination. Next slide, please. This is consistent with the middle way approach, which His Holiness has been articulating for a long time now. That the negotiation should be based on compromise, based on the core interest of China and Tibet, within the framework of the Chinese Constitution, but ensuring genuine autonomy, genuine self-determination to the Tibetan people. This has been mentioned. The next point has been mentioned by Arif. The claim that Tibet has been a part of China since ancient times is as untrue as the fact that the sun rises in the west, right? And His Holiness, of course, will never agree to this, which has been a precondition of China to come to the negotiating table. And the US now officially rejects this, and this has become a US policy now because it's in the act that China has sovereignty over Tibet since ancient times. Another key element of the act is the fact that the Tibetans have a unique identity, unique religion, unique culture, unique language, a unique way of life, and China must respect and must advocate, must address this multifaceted aspect of Tibetan culture and heritage and identity. And finally, the Act empowers the special coordinator for Tibet to actively and directly counter the false information propaganda which China is very well known for. Regarding Tibet, regarding the history of Tibet, regarding the people of Tibet, regarding Dalai Lama himself. So, and also to ensure that the special coordinator for Tibet works in coordination with all the other departments of the US government to counter this false information, disinformation about Tibet. Now, His Holiness commands wide respect amongst Tibetans in Tibet and the Tibetan diaspora and across the world rather, not only amongst Tibetans but also amongst all the non-Tibetans. So, and he has committed himself to a negotiated solution to the Tinos see no conflict. And in the absence of His Holiness, it will be that much more difficult for any kind of solution. So it's urgent. Its situation is urgent, and it's very, very necessary that some kind of solution is brought in, and this is why the situation is urgent, because His Holiness turns 90 next month, and we pray for his very, very long life and for his healthy life, but he's a mortal being, so some kind of solution has to emerge while His Holiness is there to bless us all. The panel is also about the road ahead. The US Congress, by bringing this legislation, has taken the first step, and President Biden already signed it into the act. But it's the first step. But that, as you know, China. Yes, I'll finish it. As you know, China obviously has reacted very aggressively and nastily to this, and it will continue to do so. So we expect the U.S. government to to be prepared to take responsibility for the fallout and the outcomes of this act on the Tibetan people, both within Tibet and outside Tibet. It's a remarkable framework or template which can be an inspiration for other parliaments across the globe, including my own parliament. There is need for a stronger interparliamentary alliance, and Chris has already mentioned about IPAC, of which I'm a founding member, and I'm also the co-chair for India of IPAC. And we need stronger alliances. I mean, or we need to make IPAC even further stronger to ensure that the Tibetan voice are heard in every forum of global governance. For instance, we could talk of the ecological accountability of Tibet, of China, sorry, in Tibet, at the UNFCCC, at COP negotiations. And finally, we are duty bound as lawmakers to stand on the right side of history. We have to ensure that Tibet is not forgotten, maybe through private member bills, maybe through parliamentary resolutions. We have to keep the issue of Tibet alive in our respective parliaments. We could start with some sort of apolitical resolutions or statements like wishing His Holiness on his 90th birthday, on environment, on Buddhist culture, on the reincarnation of His Holiness. So these are issues which the lawmakers can immediately take up in their respective parliaments, taking cue and inspiration from the Resolve Tibet Act. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you, Sujeet. Thank you, Sujeet, for that. Turning now to Pavel Žáček. Amongst many claims to fame, he is the chairman of the Security Committee, a member of the Chamber of Deputies, still and remains a member of Parliament, but not a member of the Commonwealth, which you probably think is a good thing. I don't know, but that's not the point of the panel. Pavel, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that presentation. Honorable members of the Japanese Parliament, honorable members, Tibetan Parliament in exile, distinguished colleagues, and friends of Free Tibet. Thank you for the kind invitation to speak today. I'm honored to represent the Czech Chamber of Deputies here in Tokyo and to share our long-standing commitment to the cause of Tibetan people. In our history, the Czechs have known the sufferings of oppressive regimes. We were experienced under communist oppression or with communist oppression, and that painful past has taught us the value of freedom, of human dignity. It is for this reason that we deeply understand the struggles faced by the Tibetan people. When our democracy was restored in Czechoslovakia in the early 1990s, we embraced the cause of Tibet as a natural extension of our own quest of liberty and justice. Our commitment to Tibet is not merely symbolic. During the years following our democratic rebirth, President Václav Havel, a leader of great vision and moral courage, met with His Holiness Dalai Lama on several occasions. Their meeting went beyond formal diplomacy. They reflected a strong personal bond and a mutual commitment to the cause of human rights. In a remarkable gesture, the Dalai Lama even visited our country Czech Republic, despite facing discouragement from several quarters at that time. This visit left a lasting impression on our nation and cemented our belief in the universal need to support those who fight for their identity and freedom. The tradition of support continues today. Every day, we proudly display that Tibetan flag at our we proudly display that Tibetan flag at our parliament building. Our parliamentary committees closely monitor the situation in Tibet and regularly pass a resolution that expresses our solidarity with the Tibetan people. The Czech Republic has systematically raised its concerns over Tibet not only bilaterally but also in international fora, such as UN Human Rights Council or the UN Third Committee. The Czech diplomacy also maintains active communication and links with representatives of the Tibetan government in exile and its parliament in exile. You may wonder why we are so passionate about the Tibetan issue. The answer is rooted in our own hard-won experience. We are deeply sensitive to any threat against the principles of freedom, democracy, and human dignity. History has shown us that if these values are allowed to erode in one corner of the world, they will eventually weaken anywhere, including in our own society. Protecting these universal rights is, in essence, safeguarding our own future. At times, we have heard claims that our approach is anti-Chinese or that, by supporting Tibet, he harm Chinese national interests. Let me be clear. Our approach is not about taking sides against any nation. We do not follow the official One China principle to the letter. Instead, we have developed our own One China policy, a fact that China has acknowledgement in our bilateral agreements. Most importantly, our support for the Tibetan cause is based on the belief that every people has the right to self-determination and that Tibetans deserve to exercise that right within a framework of autonomy. We believe that it is in everyone's interest, including China's, to respect commitments to international law and the basic principles of the UN Charter. I would also like to briefly address a recent development that aligns with our long-standing approach. The recently enacted Tibet-China Dispute Act is in the United States reaffirms US support for Tibetan self-determination and encourages their dialogue between China and Tibetan representatives without preconditions. This act finds that earlier negotiations failed because China imposed demands such as insisting that Dalai Lama acknowledges that Tibet has always been a part of China, which are historically incorrect and have been rightly rejected by the Dalai Lama. It calls on China to cease the spread of disinformation regarding Tibet and stresses the importance of adhering to international human rights treaties. By promoting substantive dialogue and countering misinformation, the Act strengthens efforts to support Tibet's aspiration globally. This act resonates strongly with the Czech approach. Just as the United States Act emphasized self-determination, respect for a distinct cultural identity, and the need for honest dialogue, our own policies mirror these values. Our continuous support for the Tibetan cause is part of a direct and sincere commitment to these universal principles. Unfortunately, developments in Tibet suggest that persistent problems have not yet been solved. Concerns of the loss of the Tibetan identity are valid due to the intensive attitude of the authoritarian regime in Beijing towards the Tibetan community. Imposed religious constraints eliminate the very essence of the Tibetan way of life with its unique spirituality and cultural heritage. The Tibetan cause must therefore not lose our attention in spite of the turbulent global development. In conclusion, I stand in front of you As a representative of a nation that has risen from the hardship of communism to become a strong advocate for freedom and human rights around the world, we remain steadfast in our dedication to supporting dialogue, countering disinformation, and upholding the values that bind us as free people. I would like to extend my sincere appreciation to our hosts here in Tokyo, as well as to everyone participating in this conference. Let us work together to support justice, uphold human rights, and build a future where every nation respects the universal ideas we all believe. Thank you for your attention.
Can I just acknowledge, Pavel, your contributions, Sujeet as well, and Arif. We have actually about 20 minutes left to take, obviously, thoughts, comments and questions from the floor. And I think one of the key themes here is this Resolve Tibet Act that the United States has passed is something that we see as a good thing. It adds a clarity legally, morally, to the question around Tibet. And so, as much as wanting questions, of course, to the panel from delegates of what can we do in our own jurisdictions to amplify this work. And if I might just very quickly, and I will stress that word very quickly, or two words, it somewhat could parallel work that's happening. This is around the Taiwan situation. You'll be familiar with the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 2758, which is around China, as we know, or Communist China, and Taiwan, which China has aggressively misinterpreted. And a number of jurisdictions around the world have passed resolutions in their parliaments or senates, which I think is to be applauded. The likes of Australia. Who thinks that a New Zealander would praise Australia? What a strange day. No, only kidding. Australia, the Netherlands, the EU Parliament, the United Kingdom, Belgium, Canada, and I believe the Czech Senate, and apologies if I've missed anyone out. But as I was reflecting on this panel, and granted that's a parliamentary resolution, not a piece of law, these are parliaments actively working to push back against the narrative, and as each parliament adds its name, it strengthens the work. One quick spanner I will throw in the mix before we take your questions is that actually Arif and I have a question. Do you want to ask it actually around the special coordinator? You were asking.
Well, sure. We were just chatting with one another as we were going through, and Sujeet's slide presentation prompted me to think about this, but the American legislation talks about having a special coordinator on Tibet, specifically within the State Department, and whether there are any other nation states that have such a designated role, because I'm not aware of any. So I think that's an important piece. But since I have the mic, Simon, can I just raise one other thing? It's just that I think it's important to think strategically about what we're doing here. And I don't think I'm a sole anomaly in this room, but I think I may be a bit of a exceptional situation. But whether it was at this WPCT or at previous ones, I've noticed that there's usually a strong cohort of opposition parliamentarians and sometimes less that form part of the government, right? So Sujeet and I are both part of governing parties in our respective jurisdictions, but I'm not sure if that's the norm. But I would urge you to think about this conceptually from different perspectives. So going back again to Elsa's presentation, what I've seen very, very well in Canada is opposition parliamentarians holding my government and other governments to account through things such as questions in the House of Commons, things like order paper questions that command a response, or even petitions. And petition in Canada compels a government response within 30 days. What I've seen also effectively, and I'm going to pat myself on the back here, is that Liberals, colleagues of mine, have worked strategically behind closed doors to ensure that the powers that be, whether that's my colleagues at the cabinet table or before I got to cabinet, other sort of power brokers in the governing party, sensitizing them to these issues so that government policy changes. And again, to go back to something that Elsa's point raised, when you can actually change policy, it actually sends a strong indication to the civil servants. And what we did in Canada is, given our foreign policy orientation, what we were seeing with China, we recrafted it and rebranded it an Indo-Pacific strategy, which targeted nations such as India and the nation we now sit in, Japan, for a renewed focus on Asia. But it also specifically outlined, and I agree with you, Els, that in one sentence we talked about our approach to China will include raising regularly human rights abuses that relate to, quote, Uyghurs and Tibetans. It's in black and white in the policy. That gives the legitimacy to people who work in our Department of Foreign Affairs, Global Affairs Canada, in the American context, the State Department, for them to say, look, this is part of our official policy. We need to raise this every time we have a meeting. That, I think, is important. And that's the message I want to convey to all of you, is that think outside of the box, whether you're government or whether you're opposition, what levers you can use to get us to the same place, because we need to be heading in that same direction. Sorry, very long discussion that started with the special coordinator and went a bit further. But we had 20 minutes because I was cut off early, apparently.
And we're all politicians or former, and once you've got the microphone. Turning over to colleagues, are there any questions or thoughts that anyone would like to share, particularly on, and I will come to Chris, and I can see Tenzin here as well. Obviously, the path forward, and in doing so, would you just give us your name and the country to start? So, Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Simon. Chris Law, Member of Parliament for the UK and Chair of the All-Party Group on Tibet. I guess the question I wanted to ask is about national governments being fearful in terms of upsetting China. And what advice would you give for governments, not opposition, but governments themselves, working together collaboratively in order to develop policies they can do in tandem? And the example I think of just now in Europe, of course, is how European states are working together in tandem when it comes to Ukraine. Or indeed, at the moment, France and the UK working closely together to look at recognising the state of Palestine. So usually, as my experience 10 years in Parliament has been, that often there's a lot of timidity in the Foreign Office for fear of upsetting the greater neighbour, China in this case. And I wanted to know if you had some experience or some advice you would give where nation states, governments can work together collectively, even if it's in the background, in order to come forward with a bold statement together. Particularly, for example, the Resolve Tibet Act. That's something the UK could be doing. But my honest opinion is it would never do it on its own. Thank you.
Pavel, could we start with you, your thoughts, and I'll turn then to you, Sujeet.
Sure.
Thank you. Actually, I can make 2 points. One is official part of foreign policy, for example, of the Czech Republic, of course. We discuss and we change our policy, we updated our policy to Indo-Pacific, specifically to main strategic partners. We are still discussing about changes in our policy to China. Of course, under that official level, there is some, and I am the case of that, there is the parliamentary diplomacy dimension, which is more open for discussion, more open for this kind of communication and support of our partners and friends. And of course, there is something which I mentioned in my speech. There is morally historical elements of from our past. I mentioned Václav Havel's ideas. He was a really close friend to Dalai Lama, and that is something which is for all of us, for almost, not for 100% of course, but for the people and for the political parties which were close to Václav Havel's ideas, something which we have to still open in our discussion, which we have to communicate and not just focus on the real policy of our foreign office, for example. And maybe I will mention one more point, which is really important. It's a part of we are facing the really special situation in these days in the whole world, and we are facing the crisis which started with from the authoritarian regime, mainly Russian Federation and China. We are trying to do our best to keep a safe world and to keep peace. But I will repeat it again. We have to be close to each other, and we have to communicate with our friends, such as Tibetan people to be ready to prepare not just our but their future as well.
Thank you. Sujeet, anything you wanted to add?
Well, I don't think, speaking about India, I don't think India is timid, maybe diffident when it comes to dealing with China. Partly because, you know, we are the only country that shares a 3,600 kilometer long border with Tibet, right, which is occupied by China. The government of India's thinking is we have to be practical. Even today, 80% of our pharma APIs come from China. So there is a real danger that, you know, China could stop export of these pharma APIs, which will cripple the Indian pharma industry. And as the largest democracy on earth, as the mother of democracy, I would certainly want my government to be more articulate, more assertive when it comes to dealing with China vis-a-vis the cause of Tibet. But I think, you know, the understanding is there, the intent is there, but you know, as I said, the practical considerations inhibit India's kind of response which should have been there. But having said that, we need to understand that, you know, we have a border police force called ITBP, Indo-Tibet Border Police. The Chinese have been exerting a lot of pressure on India to rename it as the India-China Border Police, or at least call it the India Border Police, which the Indian government has refused to do so. This was set up in 1962. So since then, you know, it has been called, still being called the Indo-Tibet Border Police, Border Force, ITBP. Border is interchangeably used. You know, just imagine when His Holiness came to India in 1959 with thousands of his supporters, how difficult it must have been for India then, a new nation. It was like independent just 12 years ago, with you know, and with the kind of aggression which China had. So these are practical considerations. We have a country on the western side which is using terrorism as a state policy, as a tool of fighting warfare with India. So these are practical considerations which, in my view, I'm not, you know, necessarily justifying this, but these are the realities which I think the government of India faces when it has to deal with China. But certainly, as I said, I would like my government to be far more assertive than what it is today.
And Arif, I know you've got some thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, for the question. I'll speak to the G7 context. That's the one I'm the most familiar with. I think the most important thing is finding commonality. Second most important thing is doing it incrementally. And I think the lowest hanging fruit on this is what we heard about a bit yesterday, and more yesterday and a tiny bit today, which is the environment. I think that is fundamental in terms of sort of the water tower of Asia, the 10 rivers that we heard about, the impact on almost 2 billion people. And I think there's a way of marrying the environmental concern with some concerns that are purely economically driven on the part of the G7. As a natural resource powerhouse in Canada, as an energy exporter, we have something to offer the world in terms of clean energy and getting it out to different parts of the world. But as we deliver that, so I'm thinking about the LNG we can deliver to places like India and China as they're transitioning. As we deliver that, we need to also be coupling that discussion with the fact that, you know, your environmental concerns are actually the globe's environmental concerns, and they relate to how you treat Tibet. I think what's unique here is that it's important that you raised Ukraine, is that on this one, sometimes the G7, if we're being honest, is a little bit, you know, us versus them. There's a bit of an internal division. Think about tariffs and trade over the last 3 months. But on this one, the G7 is unified, right? Because the Americans are exactly aligned with the other 6 members in terms of what needs to be done vis-a-vis China. So that opportunity should not be vanquished. I'm going to look at Sikyong and actually say something that I noted with respect to the 9 conventions that we've had. With Japan, you now have 4 G7 members that have hosted this. I think the next piece of advocacy needs to be talking to France, the UK, and I believe it's Germany about, hey, it's time to step up and host this kind of convention because it's important in terms of global leadership. But those are important points, and it's obviously an ongoing dialogue.
I think there was a question to my right.
It is partly a question and partly a remark. I honestly took the participation because I was born in Tibet. I won't tell you or can't tell you where I was born. I was as a refugee for the last 4 years. And when I have to contact my mother in Tibet, I have to contact somebody in the United States and tell their family to go to my family and tell them how well-being I am and how fine I am, just to tell that world. This is the situation of transnational repression, which I'm personally telling you. And the second thing is, how many of you who flew to Tokyo booked the flight ticket with one stop in any part of China? Anybody? I tried. But then I realized that my travel documents say born in that place, in Tibet, and then I fear, because at the immigration in Japan, in Narita airport, I was stopped for 15 minutes because it was written stateless. So they have the protocol to follow. Now I fear what kind of protocol that Hong Kong airport will follow if I go by or fly by Cathay Pacific. So this is a fear that I have in my mind, in my heart. Every year, whenever I try to fly wherever, I have to fly as a member of parliament, even though. So my urge to the members of parliament, particularly the member attendance here, is if you speak in your parliament, even if you are in the back bench, even if you are the cross bench, even if you are in the treasury benches, even if you speak for 1 minute in the parliament on Tibet, it is the voice of the voiceless of 60 million Tibetan peoples inside Tibet. Your word give and provide a beacon of hope for the Tibetans, including my mother and my half-sister, who I have never seen in the last 20 years. This is the kind of the situation I really wanted to urge you. Therefore, please take the opportunity. I know you are brave because you are here. That's the one evidence of your bravery and your courage having attended this convention. And at the same time, my question to you is how we can, from the outside, promote more members of the parliament to be part of the Tibetan support groups, particularly in other countries where China has more control and influence over the country and fear. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tenzin. I'll turn to Sujeet first, but I'll just throw my quick thought in, which is the one thing I've found is actually actively going up to my political colleagues and asking. And I know that sounds completely simplistic, and I know many of you will have done so, but it's very easy to talk in general terms, but to actually go up to them face to face, or being in New Zealand over a beer, and putting it to them, come and join. And when they seem different, to say, well, why would you not want to be part of something which is so fundamental to human rights? Anyway, Sujeet.
Well, I think I did partially mention this yesterday. We need to, increase the information that is available and disseminate it as widely as possible. I feel that not enough is being done to leverage the power of social media by our Tibetan brothers and sisters. China is the king of information, disinformation and propaganda. So the credibility of China is what it is, as you all know. But to counter that disinformation, we are not doing enough. So I think, we are lucky that we are outside Tibet. Our brothers and sisters who live inside Tibet are going through hell. So it's incumbent on all of the Tibetans who live outside Tibet to make it a priority to disseminate the history of Tibet, the reality of Tibet as much as possible. One thing which we started in India is to go to university campuses. And I said yesterday that already we have gone to 12 campuses in the last 2 years. Not enough, but at least a beginning has been made. Because the youth, unfortunately, I can speak from the Indian experience, do not know much about the history of Tibet. They broadly know that His Holiness is an asylum in India, and there is a dispute between Tibet and China. But they largely feel that it's an internal issue of China. So that narrative has to be changed. So going to university campuses can be another thing which I think a coordinated effort can be made between the diaspora and between different countries. And finally, naming and shaming. Again, typical bully, China is a typical bully, and as all bullies, the moment you stand up to the bully, they will back out. But if you continue listening and agreeing to what the bully says, they will bully you more. So name and shame China, name and shame the officials as much as possible. Prepare a repository or a database of all the atrocities that's being committed. So these are steps that can be done, and then of course we need to build more parliamentary alliances. IPAC is a great example. We need to make IPAC stronger. We need to build new alliances. I guess these are some of the steps that can be done immediately and practical steps.
Thank you, Sujeet. Arif.
I'm just going to build on. I'm going to build on Sujeet's point about the universities. There's one thing that we do really well in Canada. Is one of the first conversations I had with Sik Yong La is about our internship program. So we've had a parliamentary friendship group for a long time. When I took over the chairmanship, we started to expand this internship program where we bring Tibetan Canadians to Ottawa and we have them work for about 6 or 8 weeks with different members of parliament. Why is this good? One, you're building capacity amongst Tibetan leaders. That's a great thing. But two is that they become advocates and avatars of the cause amongst parliamentarians in different parties. You'd be amazed at how many of these people teach the MPs as much as they are learning from the MPs. And the MPs then end up hiring them on as full-time staffers. And we've had MPs that may have been active on things such as forced labor, maybe understood the Uyghur issue, now understand a whole different dimension about what China is doing with respect to other minorities in the PRC, which is really, really important. So that's another way of building out the group. If anyone wants to learn a bit about how we do it in Canada, I'm happy to share that. It involves sort of our parliamentary budgets, etc., but it has been tremendous, so much so that there are now Tibetan leaders who work with things like the Canada-Tibet Committee, who were my intern or other people's interns 6 or 7 years ago. So it is really helping to shape the narrative in Canada.
Thank you. And Pavel.
Let me mention the situation in the Czech Republic. I speak about long-term support of Tibet in our policy, not just Czech Senate, but also most important political parties in our chamber. But I have to mention that there was other situation 4 years ago. We had the former President, Mr. Zeman, who was close to involved in the pro-Chinese activities, and that was some kind of struggle between the political parties and Mr. Zeman, who wanted to stop all this support, all this free exchange of information about not just about Tibet, but mainly about Tibet and Taiwan and other very important for us countries. And for me, this is the result of my experiences from before 1989, from Velvet Revolution, from communist era, that most important is communication, free exchange of information, and this is something which is the main enemy of authoritarian regime. So I believe that on that level, political level, universities level, it's very important to communicate and to speak, to tell the truth, and that time will come.
Thank you, Pavel. Sujeet, I know you wanted to add something.
Just to add to what I said, another reason why we wanted to go to the universities because the youths are tech savvy, and in this age of AI, China is building its AI models where it's feeding billions of false data, false narrative into these models, and it's flooding the virtual world with the false narrative of China. So over a period of time, today you ask DeepSeek whether Arunachal Pradesh is part of India, and the answer you get is I'm not allowed to answer this or something. So just I can bet it that after 3 months or 6 months it will say Arunachal has always been part of China. So this kind of false narrative, it's going to happen with China leveraging AI in a massive way, with billions and billions of data sets feeding into its AI models. So this is precisely why I urge all my Tibetan friends to be active on the virtual world, because you need to create these data sets which talks about the reality of Tibet to counter the false narrative of China. Otherwise, you'll have AI models tomorrow which will claim that China has always had sovereignty over Tibet for ages, for time immemorial, and China has always had the authority to reincarnate Dalai Lama. So we need to massively leverage social media and the virtual world.
We've got time, I know, for one more question or statement from the floor.
Hello, everyone. First, I would like to say thank to all the members. You are all way to talk to show your support to Tibet. Also, Japanese Parliamentary Support Group for house us in this beautiful country. And my question is to Mr. Sujeet Kumar. As just before we just talk about USA Policy and Support Act for Tibet. As you know that, do you think the government of India will take a similar stand by introducing a bill and Parliament to recognize Tibetan historic state?
The short answer is I do not know because I do not represent government of India yet. No.
I like the word yet.
No, I didn't say it. Nor do I represent the party I belong to. So I'm here in my individual capacity. So I wish the government of India or the ruling coalition brings an act similar to the Resolve Tibet Act. But as I said, there are a lot of practical realities. So hopefully it will happen one day. But I cannot speak when and if at all it will happen. So.
Colleagues, I'm very conscious of time. I'm very conscious we will be holding you from lunch, which is a no-no. So lunch is for the next hour. But a couple of last messages. Firstly, to thank you for your participation. The Resolve Tibet Act, I believe, is a great step forward in how we in our own jurisdictions can amplify that. If I might, I think that needs to go alongside the likes of Magnitsky legislation and modern slavery legislation, which I'm sad to report to you that my home country has not yet passed. Can I thank those of the panel, Pavel, Arif and Sujeet. And finally, just one bit of encouragement as I've listened to different people, but from a somewhat famous person who once said that the courage of one can strengthen the spine of many. And I'm inspired by each and every one of you and the advocacy you do and the strength it gives me. So to say Thukshi She, arigato gozaimasu, merci beaucoup, and thank you very much.
Gracias.
Gracias.
Thank you. With this, we have come to the end of this session 10. We would like to thank the chair and the panelists. We will now break for lunch at the adjacent hall. Please make sure